I welcome you to the 24th session of the Cathedral Model United Nations and the first ever virtual edition of the conference. Each year, at this time, we come together, not to preserve the status quo, but to drive our world in a new direction of development and success. 24 years ago, the world was a different place, and our school undertook its mission of giving young minds from all over the country and world a platform to tackle issues that impugn the world in the most creative manner possible, thus laying down a template for generations to come. In the face of a global pandemic, CMUN 2020 has had to adapt itself to the unfortunate circumstances this year and adopt a pioneering approach to the virtual conference space we seem to be confined to for the foreseeable future. However, we're fortunate to host the 37 schools who have joined us for this edition of the conference, and with 500 delegates from over 5 countries, CMUN aims to be an enriching global experience, transcending international boundaries. This year, your experience at CMUN 2020 will not be confined to just 4 walls, but rather beyond that as you interact with delegates situated all around the globe. To add to this, for the first time ever, CMUN will be adopting a conference theme, anachronisms. With the advent of unforeseen global issues, a premeditated orthodox approach to problem solving seems to be more redundant than ever. That's why we believe that the only way to solve problems of the present is to examine and defy the precedents laid down in the past, while simultaneously considering the implications of our decisions in the future. Our committees range from ancient conclaves set in 1015 AD to transnational crime syndicates in 1929 to artificial intelligence in 2060. The plethora of committees and agendas available to delegates this year lay down the premise for an exciting conference, and every delegate or faculty advisor present here today is witness to the creation of history in front of their very own eyes. Over the next 3 days, months of relentless work will culminate in a conference that we hope will not only meet your expectations, but completely surpass them. I would now like to invite our Dean, Mrs. Isaacs, to begin the conference with a few words.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, delegates, and faculty advisors, it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the 24th Cathedral MUN. I take this opportunity to especially welcome our chief guest, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, who is well known globally as a leading economist. As far as most Indians are concerned, he is better known as the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. We viewed his appointment with a tremendous sense of elation and hope, and were saddened when his term came to an end in 2016 and he returned to the United States. In 2015, the Cathedral and John Connon School had endeavored to cajole Mr. Rajan to be our chief guest for the annual speech day, but fortune eluded us. Today, however, the good offices of our Secretary General have prevailed. This is indeed youth power in action. Thank you, Dr. Rajan, for capitulating so graciously, and I would say fairly easily. This year, CMUN has adopted an anachronistic theme wherein all committees are historic or futuristic. The students arrived at this decision after having noticed the repetitive nature of ongoing conflicts and chose to provide delegates with an unconventional and challenging experience. I wish to emphasize that CMUN is completely student-run. Let me thank our faculty advisors who stay behind the scenes, keeping a discreet though watchful eye on the proceedings. I would also like to thank our competent logistics team of senior students who have worked long hours to make sure that all is well. I wish you 3 enlightening, dynamic, and exhilarating days. Thank you all for being here with us, and thank you again, Dr. Rajan.
Thank you, Mrs. Isaacs. Now, I'd like to introduce our chief guest for the morning. Dr. Raghuram Rajan is a renowned economist and professor at the Booth School of Business in the University of Chicago. Remembered by most for his term as the 23rd governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Rajan has occupied several offices of national and international importance throughout his career. Upon his appointment in 2003, Dr. Rajan became the youngest chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. For the next 3 years, he held the IMF's research department as he revised the fund strategy and assisted multiple significant economies in reducing their payment imbalances. Following an advisory role in 2007 and the position of an honorable economic advisor under Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2008, Dr. Rajan became the chief economic advisor to the Ministry of Finance in 2012. He oversaw the preparation of the Economic Survey of India for 2012 and 2013 and used this opportunity to recommend lesser spending by the government and increased attention on skilled labor in the manufacturing sector. Dr. Rajan assumed control of the Reserve Bank of India in September 2013 and focused his efforts on limiting inflation within the country. The next 3 years witnessed the RBI adopting the Consumer Price Index as the primary indicator of inflation, introducing two-factor authentication of transactions to protect consumers and expanding India's foreign exchange reserves considerably. These reforms were met with success as record low rates of inflation were documented and a much greater population had access to banking facilities. Post the end of his term in 2016, Dr. Rajan returned to the University of Chicago and resumed his lectures. Over the course of his illustrious career, Dr. Rajan has authored several books and reports alongside other respected members in the field, most notably Nobel Prize laureate Abhijit Banerjee. His works often highlight underlying economic issues, both in India and abroad, while proposing remedies to the same. One of his latest publications, The Third Pillar: How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind, received considerable attention and was a finalist for the Financial Times Business Book of the Year award. In 2003, the American Finance Association presented Dr. Rajan with the inaugural Fisher Black Prize for the best financial researcher under 40 years of age. More recently, in 2016, he was declared the Banker magazine's Central Banker of the Year and was also featured in Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people of that year. While his astounding collection of accolades goes on, Dr. Rajan was also honored with the Yashwantrao Chavan National Award in 2018 for his unmatched contributions to the economic development of the country. Dr. Rajan has employed his thorough understanding of economics to assist some of the most essential global organizations and has been instrumental in the prosperity of not only India but also many developing countries, all while imparting his knowledge to subsequent generations and equipping them to achieve the same. On behalf of our school, it is our distinct honor to welcome Dr. Rajan and have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning, Dr. Rajan. I hope
Morning.
you're keeping well. Once
All
again,
well.
on behalf of our school, I would just like to say that we are all extremely honored and feel privileged to have you take time out of your undoubtedly busy schedule to be with us today. So thank you so much for blessing our conference with your presence as our chief guest.
Of course.
We were particularly excited to invite you because we strongly felt that a person of your professional and your personal and professional experience could share key insights with us and our delegates on the socio-economic state of the world and all the values and life lessons that you've learned and gained on your path to success. And on that note, my first question for you is, Dr. Rajan, there seems to be rising economic inequity in the world, with the richest 8 men in the world owning as much wealth as half of the world's population. Do you see any chances of this economic inequity realistically reversing in the years to come?
I think we have to work on it. That statistic, by the way, half the world's richest, 8 of the world's richest people owning more than the remaining or the lowest 50%, doesn't tell us that much because half the world is in debt. So they actually have negative assets rather than positive assets. So you and I will probably own more than that some portion of the poorest people, because they really have no assets, and many are laboring under debt. But the the inequality in incomes as well as the inequality in wealth has certainly grown in some countries. Across the world, it actually has come down over the last few decades because of the growth of China and to some extent India and other developing countries. So the between country inequality has been coming down somewhat because of the faster growth of developing countries and emerging markets, but within country inequality has increased. And even within the poorer countries, sometimes inequality has increased. India, a little uncertain, but certainly when you look at some of the wealth in Mumbai and compare it with what is happening in some other parts of the country, there is a concern about growing inequality. Now, inequality per se sometimes emerges as a result of faster growth, and that's not great, but it's not terrible either if the bottom is also coming up, even as the top grows faster. The bigger problem is when you have stagnant growth and widening inequality. And then what happens is you have a lot more internal conflict. In the industrial in the industrial West, growth rates have slowed, but inequality has increased. And that means that, for many people, their children have worse opportunities than they have. And that's a big source of concern. Most people are reasonably happy so long as their children will do better than them. But if opportunity is locked out for those children, if education is a big sort of reason for income disparities, my kids can't get a good education, then I feel aggrieved. And that sense of frustration is not just staying within countries, it is spilling out across countries. And that's, for an event like this, for a conference on um, the relationship between nations, that is a big source of worry. That is the fact that domestic politics is spilling out into an antagonism against international relations.
That was a very insightful response, Dr. Rajan. The next question I had was this. The US under Trump has completely distanced itself from meaningful initiatives to arrest global warming. If the Democrats come to power, do you see any hope for the climate change agenda globally? Do you see the US reaffirming itself as a global champion on this issue?
Almost surely that will happen. I think a big part of the Democratic presidential platform is action on climate change. I do think that every country has to respect uh, domestic forces in deciding what kinds of promises it will make. But in the United States, over the last 4 years, under the Trump administration, there has been largely a belief that one, the US has done too much relative to countries like China and India, and second, the US cannot afford to go green when there are these industries like oil and coal, which employ a lot of workers, and the US will sort of put their livelihoods at stake. And of course, there are a fair number of climate change deniers, whether that's opportunistic or whether they truly believe that climate change is not an issue. There are a number of those also in the administration. That's going to change considerably if there is a new administration in Washington. I think the Democrats are firmly of the belief that climate change is not just a challenge, it is also an opportunity to make new investments, to grow new industries. And there are a lot of business people in the US who believe that, and who also worry that a US that doesn't pay attention to climate change will end up in industries that eventually will become, will have a lot of stranded assets because those assets don't make sense in a world where emissions have to be brought down tremendously. So if you want to prepare the country for a new world, it has to start now. But that will also, with the US's tremendous prowess in research and development, bring a lot of good jobs as well as prosperity to the United States. So I think the Democrats don't see a tension between the two, and will implement significant changes in the U.S. attitude. For sure, they will rejoin all the accords that the United States has backed off from.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Rajan. I particularly like your perspective in seeing climate change action not as a challenge, but rather as an opportunity for investment. And I love how you connected to, surviving in this new world order and creating more jobs for the future. And I do agree with you largely that in order to prepare your economy and your country for the future that is to follow, it makes sense for you to prepare the country in a way that reduces emissions and aims at effectively tackling climate change. So thank you. That's a very interesting connect. My next question for you is, Dr. Rajan, you had the privilege of being a student in two of India's premier institutes, the IITs and the IIMs. And how would you compare and contrast your experience there with the University of Chicago and the American education system in general?
So, good question. I think that I would say India's sort of lacks for very little in these institutions. The quality of the students were on par with the best I've seen around the world, both at IIT, where obviously they come filtered through a very intense and rigorous exam, as well as the IIMs, where again there is an exam which tests different things. The quality of the students is very, very high. The professors are very dedicated. And so that leads to the question, why aren't some of these institutions in the top 10 in the world? Why is it that when you look at, the Shanghai Index, there are so few Indian institutions in the top few? And I would argue that some of that has to do with facilities, but what facilities do you need in a management school? Some of that has to do with the research and knowledge creating environment. And that's where, to some extent, India has fallen behind. But it's not irretrievable. It is something that can change. The universities in the West are a combination of research and teaching. The researchers aren't necessarily the best teachers, but a big difference between researchers who teach and teachers who don't do research is that the researchers who teach have a curiosity and a desire to keep up with what's going on. And it's not that they're going to teach their research. Their research is often sort of narrow and not particularly path-breaking to teach in the classroom. But it is that they are curious. And what you need for teaching at a university level is constantly changing your material to keep up with what is going on in the world. And you can't teach, a 30-year-old or 40-year-old material because that's what you started teaching, and you haven't really changed your notes ever since. That, to my mind, is one big difference in the quality of the teaching. But of course, I think we have great teachers in our universities, who don't necessarily do research, but who are curious, keep up. But sometimes they are the exception rather than the rule. And that tends to depress the overall quality of teaching. But of course, these rankings rank not just the quality of teaching, but also the research output, the productivity of the faculty, and so on. And on those dimensions, we often fall behind. When you look at China, they've made big changes, and many of their universities are not on the top, 100. Uh, I don't think it's beyond us. I think we can do it. We need a determined effort, but that also means that we need to look at education as a separate industry, so to speak. It seems a contradiction in terms to call education an industry. It is one, with different goals, different objectives, much less focus on hopefully on money. But you cannot you cannot ignore the needs of the industry, and hopefully we will do what is necessary.
So just to follow up to that, if education is to be viewed as an industry, Dr. Rajan, then what industrial changes as such would you recommend India undertake in order to best achieve global competitiveness with these other universities that are ranked on the Shanghai indexes?
Well, I think it's important to look at education as an export industry. I mean, think about how many young kids, many of you in this room, are going to be exported abroad, because you will not stay and go to our IITs and IIMs. You will go, some because you can afford it, some because it's more difficult to get in here than to get into a equally or if not better school elsewhere. So we export a ton of our brightest minds, and unfortunately we get back only a fraction because many decide to make a life outside. Now, why is this a good policy from a government perspective? I'm not saying that kids should be imprisoned. I sort of benefited from our ability to train and then allow people to go out. But it would be even better if we could keep them here, and not just keep them here. That's that's export substitution in a sense. We're sort of, what's the right word? It's import substitution, because we're importing education services. We are substituting for that by creating our own education services. But more than that, we could be teaching kids in Africa, we could be teaching kids in the Middle East, we could be teaching kids in East Asia if we had strong universities. So investing in our universities, of course, we should invest in our schools, and hopefully, over time we'll do much more. But we should also invest in our universities and create strong universities that is going to be an industry that will generate an enormous amount in terms of revenue, but it will also generate minds that create the India of the future, that stay in India and create the India of the future. And education is something that needs to be taken very seriously. But for that, you have to fight a lot of vested interests in the education sector. Um, People who like the way things are going, partly because it's comfortable, partly because some people make money off this kind of structure with all the private colleges that are around providing modest educations. And so you need to be able to fight that. It is impossible for an entity today to get a license to open an educational institution, even if you're nonprofit, even if you have enough sort of resources, and even if you have the right credentials, because it's a very heavily guarded sector because of the interests in the sector.
Thank you for that relevant response, Dr. Rajan. I think it was particularly relevant to our conference, since a lot of our delegates are going to be considering going to university abroad in the next few years. And Anya and I ourselves are considering going to university abroad next year. So I do agree with you, the education system does need changes. But moving on to my next question, I always think it's more important for people to make mistakes and learn from them rather than live perfect lives with complete guidance. Keeping that in mind, could you tell us an anecdotal story about what you deem to be your biggest failure and what you learned from it?
This sounds like a job interview. And the usual answer in such to such questions is to give you a story which shows how great you are, but even while failing, how wonderful you are and worth hiring, right? So it's a good question for all of you to know the answer to. I haven't actually thought about this carefully. Look, there are many places where you do not succeed, and when you look at people who have reached where they've reached, you often think this is an unmitigated line of successes, how lucky they are, how wonderful they are, etc. But very few people have that line of success of many failures along the way. And sometimes that old adage, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," is actually at work. That through failure you learn, and you hopefully become tougher and better. And that's important to realize that take somebody like Winston Churchill. Of course, his reputation has taken a downturn in recent years, for his racism and his staunch imperialism. But many people in the United Kingdom would view him as the greatest prime minister, certainly in the 20th century, for the what he did during the Second World War, how he kept the country together and fought Adolf Hitler. If you look at Churchill's sort of life, yeah, he was fairly successful at a young age, but in the 30s, he was a politician everybody had given up on. He was a drunkard. He was unreliable, untrustworthy. Words, descriptions you would not associate with the greatest prime minister of the United Kingdom in the 20th century. So again, I mean, he was depressive, and there were, periods when he felt like giving up. The world was going by. His life was over. He was in his 60s, and really hadn't achieved, had basically achieved failures. As in the First World War, when he was a minister, he had a big military failure in Turkey, and so there, successes are built on failures, and that's important for students to remember. I mean, you asked me, I have a lot of academic publications, but for every academic publication, I've had multiple rejections at journals. In fact, the first day I reached the University of Chicago, my thesis was rejected by the sort of University of Chicago's journal. And rejections of your work are sort of normal course for most people who write. But it's painful because somebody's telling you your work doesn't pass the hurdle. But over time you learn, and eventually somebody actually publishes your stuff. And so when people look back, they say, "Oh, so many publications," but they don't know the blood, sweat, and toil that has gone into those publications, and the heartbreak. So it's important to remember, everybody has failures. The key sort of mark is how you learn from them, how you pick yourself up, and how you go forward.
Dr. Rajan, I really, really appreciate what you just said right now, because I think a lot of us, especially in this rat race kind of world that we live in today, glorify the successes but forget to acknowledge or even see the failures on which those successes were built. And I think that that's a really crucial thing, because without using your failures as stepping stones to achieve your goals in the long run, you're really not learning as much, and you're not experiencing life as it was meant to be experienced. Because you have to learn from your mistakes. Only then will you grow, and only when you, as cliched as it may sound, experience the downturns, will you really truly be grateful and appreciate the maximas of your life. So I really appreciate you giving that piece of advice and sharing that with us today. So my question to you now is, Dr. Rajan, what do you believe is the worst problem that the world faces right now, apart from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think um, first of just to um, sort of sum up what I said earlier, I also think that failures are a time that it's important to revisit your values and what you're striving for also. Part of the learning is to ask, is what I'm trying for really what I want, and why is that useful, and should I be doing something else which might be more rewarding and a greater source of happiness. Sometimes we go in this straight line and think this is where we're meant to be, this is where society is pushing us, and part of the learning from failures is to ask questions about even the goal that you have, not to give up, but to ask serious questions. Should I really be doing this, or should I be doing something else? And sometimes that's the greatest learning, to shift course and to go towards something which eventually turns out to be much more rewarding. Now, on the problems, there are so many sort of issues that I think are posing challenges to our world. You already talked about inequality. I would say a consequence of all this is rampant majoritarianism in the U.S. With the revival of white supremacy in some quarters. Again, I would say there's a very strong pushback now, certainly post George Floyd, but it is a source of concern. In India, the majoritarianism that is prevalent now, I have never seen it at this level in the past, and I worry that it's taking us down a path which is dark and divisive, and is not conducive to what our founding fathers really believed in, and so it's up to us, all citizens of India, but also people from outside, to make a change, that fight for what you think is right, and fight against forces that tend to push inequality, whether it is economic inequality or it is political and social inequality. Our country was based on the idea that everyone is equal, everyone deserves an equal chance. Our directive principles are sort of paeans to good governance, and we should try and respect that going forward. That's really in all our interest, and so I would say, again, we talked earlier about inequality, economic inequality, causing a push towards exclusion, towards backing off from international relations, and so on. And one of the consequences of that, not the, not always a direct consequence, is this majoritarianism, which I think has to be combated.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Rajan. I would have to agree with you over there. And I think combating groupthink and just the herd mentality, which has been created, at least in our country, the past couple of months, I would say, is one of the major things that we hope to change at CMUN. We hope to give every delegate their own platform, their own voice. Do you have any questions for us before we ask you our last question?
Well, I first, I would like to thank both the faculty, the teachers, as well as the students, the organizers, as well as the delegates to this conference. First, for inviting me, then for listening to me. My question really is about how you guys are coping in this period of, it's a tremendous sort of tragedy that is befallen the world with COVID. And it's especially affecting, obviously, young kids. People like you, I presume many of you are in your last year in school, a year when you celebrate, and you sort of are jumping out into the new world, and there are lots of ceremonies, traditions, of course exams also, that accompany that movement. And it's so difficult and so different when everything is done online. So how are you coping, and what are your thoughts about it?
Ayush, can I answer first?
Yeah, sure. I'll follow after you.
So I guess for us, obviously the situation is not ideal, and as you said, Dr. Rajan, it is our last year in school, so it is a shame that we do not get to enjoy all of our school traditions as we normally would, that we've been looking forward to ever since we stepped foot into school. That being said, I think our school has at least tried the best that it can, to ensure that the learning environment and that some events at least can be replicated. And well, CMUN 2020 is one of those events. A lot of hard work went, and a lot of support from our teachers and from our students went into planning the conference this year. And although we would have loved to have it in person, we tried to make the best of the situation. We wouldn't have been able to host you, for example, had it been in person. So that's a big plus to having the conference online, of course. And I think emotionally and personally, it is obviously taxing for students and for all of us as well. But I think it's also going to make us appreciate the next few years and the freedoms that we normally enjoy but are not. But they're so, we take them so for granted that we don't really appreciate even our freedom to breathe freely, enough. And I think going forward, having experienced this for our entire lifetime, we're going to just be more grateful for our access to healthcare and all of the liberties that we, not only as part of a very privileged section of society, enjoy, but also as humans enjoy and take advantage of. So I think from my side, that is how I feel and where I stand. Ayush?
I think Ananya's answer encapsulates a lot of what I want to say. But from my side, I think, well, I'm not going to lie, it is heartbreaking for all of us. This entire year has been really heartbreaking for students all over the world. It not just India. This has happened all over the world because the lack of social interaction and just the lack of opportunities that we faced this year is something that's been globally felt. It's not just been limited to us. But I also think that it's about resilience as well. Ananya spoke about appreciation, but I think a bigger learning outcome for us over here is resilience because I I foresee the world facing many situations like these. Maybe not a pandemic, but of course, I still see the world facing so many more problems in the future. And I think this is one of the most significant problems that our generation has had to face. And I think more than anything, it's prepared us for the future. And it's prepared us to, like, it's helped us learn how to tackle these sort of situations and these problems in the future. It's built an innate resilience in us that I don't think anything ever could. Again, I'd have to revert back to what you said. What doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. And that's the case over here, at least for me. I've learned a
Yeah.
lot from this pandemic, and I definitely see it translating into uh, I see it translating into success in the future. So yeah, that's all
Well,
from me.
that's a great response from both of you, and I admire the resilience in the midst of great adversity. But yes, look for silver linings in every one of these. So I'm glad to see that. So you have a last question?
Yeah. Again, I'm so sorry that we've already taken up so much of your time, but our last question for you is just this. You have 515 to 17-year-old students hearing this right now. What is the one piece of advice, in addition to everything that you've said so far, obviously, that you'd want to give them?
Well, it's not so much advice. I think when you reach a certain age, you feel only, you know, you think you can keep giving advice. And of course, you people are entering, leaving school, entering the world in a very different environment than the one we left school and entered the world in. And so a lot of the advice that people like me have, it's probably dated, probably less relevant for the challenges and the difficulties that some of you have, as well as the opportunities that you have. But look, you know, my sense is that you are, I mean, this is pretty obvious, you are the future of the world. You will have tremendous challenges to deal with. We've been a terrible generation in the sense that we've left you with significantly more debt, significantly more political fracture, and a untackled problem of climate change. What I think, sort of apart from these terrible legacies, what positive I think we have left is you're probably the most educated generation in the history of the world. Education has kept growing. You're probably the most woke generation in the history of the world. You have a sense of the kind of inequalities, inequities that pervade the world. And so you have the chance to fix what we broke. And I think that you start at this stage while you're not in positions of leadership by holding your current leaders to account. And I see that in much of what Indian youth have been doing in the last few years, in the marches, in the protests, but also in people who are doing work every day and making this country move forward. But we have to do a lot more because the problems you inherit are significantly bigger. And so you can't be better prepared than going through a school like Cathedral. And now that you have that bit of positive legacy, I think it's your responsibility to do yet more, to rise to the challenges that we have, and to meet them head on. Now, you still have some more preparation to do. You have, many of you will go through college, some of you will do PhDs, but remember that you have, and many of you are coming to this conference because you have that spirit. You have a public charge, and that is something the world typically has done, made the world better for their children. I think my generation hasn't done as well on that, but it can be remedied. We do go up and down sometimes, and it is your charge to make this a better place. And one good place to start is with a conference like this, to debate the problems we have and think about what solutions you would have. But then don't let those solutions die in the committee room. Take them out and make sure that they are, in fact, implemented by the world. So good luck on your conference. And I hope you think great thoughts and have great discussions over the next few days.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. We really hope that our conference can live up to your expectations. We really hope that we can actually implement positive change. I would now like to invite our Secretary General, Ananya Purushottam, to deliver her address.
Thank you, Ayush, and thank you, Dr. Rajan. Good morning, Dr. Rajan, Mrs. Isaacs, Dr. Parmar, Mrs. Roberts, faculty advisors, and of course, delegates. It is with immense pride and pleasure that I welcome you all to the opening ceremony of the Cathedral Model United Nations Conference, the oldest Model UN conference in the country. For the last 24 years, future diplomats such as yourselves have joined us to consistently form the most revolutionary symposium of young minds our country has ever seen. Now, many of you watching me today have probably heard countless other speeches given by leaders, politicians, speakers on the current state of the world. And speeches of this nature usually focus on some exigent global issue or the other, whether it be the famines in Yemen, the civil war in Syria, or the censorship in Kashmir and Korea. And although we already know of these things, my question is, do we know how abysmal they truly are? And well, if you can hear me right now, then the answer to that question is no. It is no, because the curtain of censorship has not fallen on your freedom. The fear of war and death has not forced your silence. And because the threat of starvation isn't preventing you from focusing on my words right now. But I do not stand before you today to make you feel guilty about your privilege. After all, I share this privilege too. I do not stand before you to tell you of all the problems our world faces, when your peers' Instagram stories can probably tell you more than I can. But then what am I telling you? If I'm not speaking of problems or privilege, of causes or consequences, then what is it that I want to tell all of you? Well, it's simple. All I want to say is, Usain Bolt isn't the fastest runner in the world. Confused? I'm sure you are. Your confusion stems from two grounds. Firstly, on what basis do I challenge his success? Draped with medals and international glory, who am I as a 17-year-old high school student from India to challenge this universal stamp of distinction and honor bestowed upon by the world? After all, he's trained immensely hard, defeated his competition, and broken world records. Is this not proof enough that he's the fastest man alive? But you see, this proof is where the problem lies. Proof, records, documentation. We as a community have become obsessed with these tangibles. And this glorification of the tangibles has distracted us from the intangible lines on which our world truly functions. So what if 1 million people bear witness as Bolt surges past the finish line? Does that make him the best? Or just the best as we know it? But then naturally, this begs the question, if Bolt isn't the fastest athlete in the world, then who is? Well, have you ever seen how fast a mother runs when she hears her child cry in the middle of the night? Or how rapidly children in conflict-torn homes and countries run from their abusers? Or how quickly American billionaires run for president? Who records these races? And here's where the second point of confusion comes in. What does any of this have to do with Model UN? The connection is simple. This attitude of ours, this warped perception of recognition of tangibles that we have, neglects the most important instruments of change. Because we sit here and we recognize the problems, but not the solutions. We recognize the present, but not the potential of the future to be better. Not the potential of our corrupt politicians or of our kind billionaire philanthropists who are ever so charitable in donating a fraction of their income, but rather the potential I see in each one of you. I have this platform open to me today because 5 years ago, someone saw this same potential in me. Recognize that you are here for the very same reason. Today, I get the honor and privilege of addressing you. Today, I stand here, but tomorrow it could be you. Now, you may think you are not capable. It may be your first such conference or your 10th, and you have already resigned yourself to not being the best diplomat in the room because you are using this metric of awards and not your potential to judge your ability. But trust me when I say that unharnessed potential can go a long way if only someone takes the effort to realize it. So take that effort, delegates. Because mark my words, there is no one alive that is not capable of doing more than what they think they can do. In being present here today, you have already achieved more than any piece of paper could ever quantify. Your presence here today marks your determination to participate in the conversation for change. Because so many issues have the potential of being discussed, but are ultimately never tackled. But these issues still hold value through the dialogue we have, in which people start expecting what we advocate for to be the new normal. And when this conversation and change is set into motion, there will come a time when genuine young leaders like you who want to take action for these causes cannot be doubted for their intentions. The potential and value of the conversations you have today and over the next 3 days will only be realized a decade down the line. But that doesn't make this discourse any less important. Because remember, there are times before these debates even had a stage to occur. Even raising the question of equality for women, democracy, interracial relationships was taboo. In the past, a lot of the change was just performative support. But what discourse does is it reshapes morality in such a beautiful fashion that it helps lay the foundation for change to follow. Now, today's politicians may not be able to enact the change we want, even if we hold them accountable. But by having these conversations, we ensure that the next wave of politicians will be able to implement the ideals that we as a community stand for. Therefore, I urge you to go into committee with the aim of being the best that you can. Do not worry about imitating the perceived or already established best. Because after all, anyone who became someone did not do so by being like everyone. So do not let these extraneous variables like experience, awards, or age deter you. Ignore these tangibles, because we've seen how in leading our lives along their lines, we reach questionable conclusions. And I promise you, if all of us focused less on being the best and more on just being the best that we can be, the world would be a better place. So today, as you enter committee with all your might and determination, just remember this. Usain Bolt isn't the fastest runner in the world. He's the fastest runner that we know of. Show the world that given the chance, you can run faster. Exploit this opportunity to realize your potential and enact meaningful change. Take this next step, because it may be one small step today, but a decade down the line, when your children lead better lives than you do right now, you'll see that it's the step that wins us the race. So without any further delay, I'm proud to take this next step. And with the power vested in me as the Secretary General, I officially declare the 24th annual session of the Cathedral Model United Nations Conference open.